Hello and welcome to the Swayam MOOCs on economics of gender and development. In this module, we will be studying about the foundations of feminist economics. Now, I want to start by also recalling that in the previous modules, we have been introduced to some of the basic issues surrounding why study of gender is important in economics. In this module, I want to highlight that feminist economics is not simply about studying women or adding women into existing economic models. It is about questioning the very foundations of economics itself, in the sense that how we define the economy, how we want to understand care economy, what we value, how do we value it, and whose lives are reflected in theories and statistics. The best way to understand or get grounded in the foundations of feminist economics is by getting introduced to some of the leading thinkers in this area. And there are two thinkers that I want to highlight in today's course. One is Marilyn Waring, who is a New Zealand economist and is a feminist economist. She has also been a member of the parliament and has been one of the leading thinkers in the area of how we want to center stage unpaid care activities or unpaid activities in the UN system of national accounts. And the second leading thinker that I want to highlight in today's class is Professor Nancy Folbre, who is an American economist and who has contributed in various ways how we want to understand social reproduction and care economy and what weight it carries when we want to understand the macroeconomic foundations of the economy. So let me begin by introducing this groundbreaking book to the learners of this course. This book was published in the year 1988, titled If Women Counted, A New Feminist Economics. And in this book, Marilyn Waring is making a very radical claim. And the claim is that the foundational claim made by Marilyn Waring is that national income accounting systems are structurally gender biased. Now, she is not saying that economists are intentionally discriminating against women, but she is saying that when the basic framework of economics was constructed, it reflected a world where men's paid work was central and women's unpaid work was peripheral. So Waring argues that sex discrimination is built into the very architecture of national accounts, particularly the GDP or the gross domestic product and the UN system of national accounts. And then she goes on to argue that sex discrimination arises from how economists define production, value, and economic activity. Now, before I can enter into why Marilyn Waring takes issue with the UN system of national accounts, or what is the basic contention that she has with the UN system of national accounts, let us first understand a very important concept in national income accounting, which is referred to as the production boundary, which is the contribution of the UN system of national accounts. Now, as students of economics, you would already have been introduced to the idea that the UN system of national accounts is a major contribution to national income accounting frameworks because it gave us the concepts of measuring of various kinds of activities within the economy, which continues to be one of the leading indicators of how we want to measure various goods and services that are produced within the national boundaries of the country. Now, what is the production boundary exactly? In national income accounting, the production boundary answers a very simple question, and that is which human activities are counted as economic production and which are not. And only those activities which are counted as economic production will be included in this boundary. And this will help us in estimating the GDP, the national income, sectoral output of goods and services, and various kinds of productivity measures. And everything outside this production boundary will then automatically be treated as non-economic, regardless of the time, effort, or social necessity of provisioning of those goods and services. So this production boundary is therefore not just a technical detail, but it is the very basic conceptual foundation of how an economy is statistically imagined. And therefore, all countries, irrespective of their cultural backdrops, have to take into consideration the UN definition of production boundary and that brings into focus a lot of comparability issues. Now, how does the UNSNA define the production boundary? The UNSNA governs how countries measure the gross domestic product. And production basically consists of all economic activities carried out under the control and responsibility of an institutional unit that uses labor, capital, and goods and services to produce output. And the very definition of how we want to measure GDP as per the UNSNA or the UN System of National Accounts has a market orientation to it, which means that activities that are more likely to be counted if they are sold in markets, or it could plausibly be sold as at observable prices, this will be referred to as activities that can be counted under GDP. So which means that manufacturing will be included, paid domestic work will be included, but unpaid domestic work will be excluded. So even when the same activity is involved in the as part of paid domestic work, it will be included as part of the UNSNA GDP calculations, but the nature of the quality of work remains to be the same, but if it is carried out under the domain of unpaid domestic work within the households, then it will be excluded from the UNSNA accounting system. So then what is included inside the production boundary? There are basically three important heads. One, as we have just discussed, market production, goods and services that are sold at economically significant prices. Second, non-market production by government or not-for-profit institutions, which will include public education, health, defense, administration. There will also be inclusion of own account production of goods, which would include subsistence agriculture, collection of firewood, construction of own dwelling, and so on. But what is important to be understood here is that when we look at own account production of goods, we are including only goods but not services, which means that if you are making available goods for your own use, they will be accounted as part of the UN System of National Account. But when it comes to services, they are outside the production boundary. So what gets included inside the production boundary as far as the UNSNA is concerned? All the goods and services that are sold in the market or transacted in the market which have economically significant prices, all those goods and services which are produced through non-market forces of production by the government or not-for-profit institutions, which means public health and education, defense administration, also own account production of goods, meaning that it is difficult to impute a market value to these goods, but these goods are provided for final use by within the households. They're accounted for in the UN System of National Accounts. But when it comes to services, they are not included in the UN System of National Accounts. So then what is explicitly excluded from the UNSNA? What is explicitly excluded are unpaid domestic services, for example, cooking, cleaning, laundry, childcare, elder care, emotional and relational labor, community care, and informal support. Now, these activities that are listed, cooking, cleaning, childcare, elder care, or community care and informal support, as you would agree, requires a lot of labor. It requires time and skills to sustain the labor force. And all of these activities in the long run go towards enabling market-based production or market production. However, the effort and time that is required to produce these services remain outside the production boundary. And why did UNSNA or the UN System of National Account design the national income accounting without including unpaid activities? It is not accidental, but it is technical. Now, there are three important technical details that can be highlighted. First is accounting consistency. Now, national income accounts rely on double entry logic. There is a balance between income and output, and there has to be comparability across time and countries. Because since the 1950s, when nation building processes began across different countries across the world, one of the important comparisons that started taking place among countries was with respect to rise in GDP and the economic growth and output within different countries. And to be able to compare growth across different countries, it became important for us to have a common estimate that can help us to identify the different pace of growth that the different countries was going through. And this is where accounting consistency became one of the major pillars of how UN system of national accounts should design the production boundary or define the production boundary. Second, as I said, is international comparability. GDP figures allow us to be compared across countries, and although it allows culturally specific definitions of household work, but it adopts a very conservative definition of production. And thirdly, the analytical focus is on markets, because markets are central to production of goods and services. So all that is transacted within the markets, or all goods and services that have a marketable price or marketed price, is something that became the focus of UN system of national accounts. And why did markets become the analytical focus? Because we want to track industrialization, we want to monitor economic growth, and that also helps us to guide macroeconomic policy. Now, what would happen if we include unpaid services within this design of UN system of national accounts? It would raise a few difficult questions. That is, who pays whom? So within the household, there are a few set of persons who are carrying out different kinds of unpaid activities, let us say child care and elder care. But then how do you impute a market value to these services? So who will be paying for these for non-marketable good services? What is the price that will be paid, and how should we avoid double counting? And also, we have to understand that in this analytical process, households are treated as consumption units and not as units of production. And this assumption that households are consumption units actually worked well for industrial economies where large numbers of people were already in the workforce. But underdeveloped economies relied heavily on unpaid activities that contributed to economic development, but it did not sit well within this design of UN system of national accounts. Now, over time, of course, the UN SNA has worked on these criticisms of non-inclusion of unpaid activities within its UN SNA design, and therefore it has developed satellite accounts, time use surveys, and many supplementary indicators to address the problem. But the basic definition of the production boundary has remained unchanged for a very long period of time. In the recent years, a few innovations have been carried out with respect to how we want to understand the production boundary. There have been a few definitional changes as well. However, if you look at national income accounts at the country level, not much implementation has taken place with regard to these definitional changes that have taken place within the UN SNA. For the time being, we can ignore some of these recent changes that have taken place in the UN SNA and move towards what is the issue that feminist economists such as Marilyn Waring, what is the contention that they have with this UN SNA design of what should be included within the production boundary. Now, Waring's contention is radical, as I mentioned. Her contention is that if you can't count it, you can't manage it. She points out that GDP is a political and gendered construct rather than a neutral measurement tool. Because when you are excluding a few activities from the production boundary, and if you look closely, if these activities are being carried out by a certain gender of population within the households, then it does not look like an accident, but a definition which is intended to keep the activities of a certain population out of accounting process altogether. GDP systematically excludes unpaid household and care work, and most of which is done by women. Similarly, activities that destroy life, for example, war, pollution, deforestation, they are counted as economic growth, whereas activities that sustain life, for example, care, subsistence, community work, they are not. And as a result, women appear economically inactive, reinforcing policy neglect and gender inequality. Now, Waring therefore goes on to extend her criticism of the production boundary. She says that unpaid household labor is excluded from both sides of the production boundary accounts, which means it is excluded from the income side because there is no imputation of market value to these services. Therefore, we do not know what is the income what is the income associated with these services, because these are unpaid activities. And similarly, they are also excluded from the production side of national accounts, because we do not know what is the contribution of these services. Although in principle we know that these services contribute to production of goods and services in the market, but without association of a marketable value to these services, we do not know what is its contribution to the production side of national accounts. So this exclusion applies to both developed and developing countries, is what Waring argues, and as a result, women appear economically inactive, their labor becomes invisible, and policy also ignores household production. So then Waring's critique became foundational for all of those innovations that have been carried out in the UN SNA, such as the satellite accounts, which has at least made an attempt to list out all of these unpaid activities, and also time use surveys. Now, in a nutshell, what Waring is arguing, and which then became one of the foundational issues surrounding feminist economics, is that GDP can be a misleading measure of well-being, because GDP growth can increase even when social well-being deteriorates. Like for example, war, environmental destruction increase GDP, child rearing, subsistence farming, care and community work do not. So therefore, GDP rewards activities that destroy life, and GDP ignores activities that sustain life. This is the radical claim which sort of brought into focus the idea that economics or mainstream economics must sidestep itself from obsessing about GDP as the most important measure of economic well-being, and bring into account other measures as well that can help us to forward the idea that there is a care economy that is standing firm behind market-based economic activities. Now, moving from Marilyn Waring, now I want us to look closely at the contributions of Nancy Folbre. Now, Nancy Folbre is a pioneering American feminist economics who has had major contributions to the field of feminist economics. I cannot do justice to the Economist's contribution in this class on foundations of feminist economics. However, there are a few important theorizations by Nancy Folbre that must be discussed in a foundational course of feminist economics. Now, unlike Marilyn Waring, who was making a radical claim outside of the mainstream economics or neoclassical economics, Folbre was working within the domains of mainstream economics and neoclassical economics, and taking issue with how we understand women's work and how we want to value care and care economy within the domain of the economy. So she asks the question, why exclusion persists even when the value of care is acknowledged? Now, neoclassical economics is built around a few basic ideas, that is, the individuals are autonomous, individuals have a lot of autonomy over their decisions, individuals are largely guided by their self-interest, and therefore we talk about utility maximization. There is market exchange taking place, the market exchange of goods and services, which means that individuals are participating in the market exercise of exchange or transaction of goods and services, and also that individuals are taking the decisions independently. So which means that there is a lot of consumer sovereignty within these markets, where individuals are able to take independent decisions. So this is the framework within on which the neoclassical economics models are built. There are various kinds of bargaining models that have come into being within the larger domain of neoclassical economics as well, and I will touch upon what is Nancy Folbre's contribution to the bargaining models within neoclassical economics. Now, one of the basic tenets that Folbre brings to this discussion is when she argues that dependency and not independence is the universal human condition. And this is a departure from the basic assumptions of neoclassical economics, which has so far been highlighting that individuals take their decisions independently, as though the households do not have any power relations within the site of consumption, and all the decisions are being taken by an independent individual. Folbre takes issue with this assumption and argues that it is dependency which is the universal human condition. She argues that every individual was once a child, maybe sick, elderly, or disabled, and the individual required care to become a productive worker. But economists treat care as a private family matter, a moral obligation, and not an economic activity. So then she introduces the care economy as a new analytical category, and she raises the question, is market efficiency always desirable? Maybe not. So for that we need to understand what is care. Basically, care involves time, it involves emotional labor, responsibility for others' well-being, and a long-term commitment. And why is care economically unique? Because care differs from standard commodities. Its quality depends upon relationships. It cannot be fully standardized. The productivity gains from care are limited, and market incentives often conflict with care quality. Now, these are very important concepts that I am introducing here, which is coming from Folbray's contribution to feminist economies. She is looking at care as one of the important pillars which contributes to economic development, which contributes to economic activities, and therefore care is economically unique. Although if you look at care, care is mostly categorized as a non-economic variable, or something which cannot be transacted, something which cannot be imputed a market value. However, you have a non-marketable category, analytical category, which contributes to market transactions. So in that sense, Folbray brings in this the care economy, which is based upon care activities, as a new analytical category, and it is distinctly different from the standard commodities available within the market. Now, care produces public goods. In economics, we always make a very stark distinction between private goods and public goods. Private goods are goods which are excludable, and over which we have complete ownership, whereas public goods are those which are non-excludable. Now, care produces public goods. Caring for children produces future workers, future taxpayers, future citizens, and the benefits of care spill over beyond the family. It is not just the family that is gaining the benefits of care within the households, it is the neighborhood, it is the community, it is the state, it is the country at large which benefits from care provided within the households. But costs of these care that are taking place within the household are borne privately, mostly by women, often unpaid or underpaid, and therefore it creates an underinvestment problem. The responsibility of the state is taken care by women within the households. It is in that context that we are arguing about care producing public goods. Let me reframe this again. Now, when we look at today's children as future workers, or when we look at today's children as future responsible taxpayers, today's children as tomorrow's future citizens, now all of these have, along with having private returns to production or private returns to education or private returns to care, as you feel like calling it, it also has social returns to private care. Now, when there are social returns to this private care, it ultimately contributes to public goods formation. But the costs are primarily borne by women or our caregivers within the households, and that is where it becomes an underinvestment problem. So then what does Folbray do here? Folbray reframes care from a women's issue to a macroeconomic coordination problem. Now, through this reframing of care as a macroeconomic coordination problem, then Folbray critiques the unitary household model. She rejects the mainstream model that assumes households act as a single decision-making unit, resources are shared equitably, and altruism ensures efficiency. There's a lot of focus on altruistic individuals who are working in their best interests. There is consumer sovereignty. Households are always working in their best interests. Folbray, on the other hand, contends and shows us that households are sites of both cooperation and conflict, and they are largely structured by gender norms, power relations, and unequal bargaining positions. Why? Because care work is often assigned not because of preference but because of social expectations. There is a certain expectations about how work needs to be divided between men and women, girls and boys within the households. There are also limited exit options. So, and this is seen more in the case of motherhood and in the case of child care, where women are bound to taking care of their children, and they have limited exit options from these unpaid care activities, where they can also participate in the market or have other freedoms within market based transactions. And these often lead to labor market discrimination, where you may have seen and experienced that married women or women with children often step back from market based activities, are relegated to the households, and have to spend a lot of time within the households without participating in market based activities. So the unitary household model is directly drawing from Folbray's reframing of economy, where care economy becomes central to the understanding of the macroeconomic production processes. Now, there is a very unique concept that Folbray also introduces, which she refers to as the structures of constraint, that women are bound by the structures of constraint. Now, she argues that labor markets often penalize caregivers. Now, penalization in the sense that because there is limited time, and we have already studied about time poverty in the previous classes. The argument here is that because there is less time left in the hand of caregivers, then the labor markets continue to undervalue the primary caregivers. They are paid less, often they are unpaid, and there is also not much demand for these workers because they are not available beyond a certain period of time. Similarly, welfare states that assume unpaid female care also becomes a structure of constraint. Social norms about motherhood and femininity and inadequate public provisioning, these factors are then referred to as the structures of constraint, and because of these factors, then women are pushed into households, or care is pushed into households, and it makes women's unpaid labor appear neutral, or it reduces women's economic autonomy. Let us understand this a little better. Now, for the learners, if you're interested to go into the details of what Folbray theorizes in the context of structures of constraint, I invite you to read the book Who Pays for the Kids? The Gender and Structures of Constraint. Now, in this book, Folbray goes on to discuss about the bargaining model in household economics, which is already one of the important frames of neoclassical economics. In mainstream economics, household decision making evolves from unitary models, as we have just studied. Household is considered to be one decision maker. And within the larger domain of neoclassical economics, we have actually evolved from unitary models to bargaining models. So the bargaining models are not exactly the contribution of feminist economists primarily, but feminist economists take some contention with the existing bargaining models. Now, what do these bargaining models assume? That instead of considering household as one decision maker, there are individuals within the households who have separate preferences. So, for example, we can talk about men and women as units of consumption, different units of consumption. We can think of children as different units of consumption or production, and so on. So, individuals have separate preferences, they say. Outcomes will depend on the bargaining power of these different individuals, and power depends on fallback position. What happens if cooperation breaks down? Now, what do we mean by these fallback position? So, for example, who owns what asset within the household? Who earns more income or less income within the household? These are all fallback options, and power depends upon these fallback options is what the bargaining models highlight. Now, the bargaining models also highlight the fact that households are site of negotiation, not always of harmony. And as I just mentioned, the outcomes will depend on the listing of income, assets, and the exit options. So, who earns how much? Who has ownership over which has assets, for example? Or what are the exit options available for different persons within the household, primarily the male caregiver or the female caregiver, and so on. and gender inequality persists within households and families, and depending upon whether the household is a site of negotiation or what kind of negotiation takes place within the household, these outcomes will determine what is the position of individuals within the families. So these assumptions are some sort of a departure from the neoclassical altruistic models. For example, in Nash bargaining, bargaining power depends upon individual income, outside options, and threat points. But Folbray argues that Nash bargaining is theoretically incomplete because it ignores social and institutional constraints. And this is how she introduces the idea of structures of constraint. So how do structures of constraint come in within these bargaining model? They basically shape bargaining outcomes even before negotiation begins. Now this is a very important contribution of Folbray to feminist economics, because when we talk about bargaining models also, we are assuming that the individuals who are a part of the bargaining have some agency to begin with, to come ahead and enter the bargaining process. But here, when we are not bringing into consideration the social and institutional constraints, for example, the sexual division of labor within the households or the sexual division of labor within the community, then the starting position is such that certain genders do not have the agency to be able to enter the bargaining process in the first place. So this is where the structures of constraint become central to the bargaining outcomes, because they are already given before the negotiation even begins. So then what are structures of constraint? Structures of constraint are external forces that systematically weaken women's bargaining power regardless of their individual preferences. We have in the earlier classes also spoken about some of these under various heads. So for example, labor market constraints. There are gender wage gaps, and much of the gender wage gaps are an outcome of the norms, of the social norms, or the perceptions that people have about differential productivity between men and women. Similarly, there is a lot of occupational segregation because society wants to put women and men into different buckets of occupations. There is this concept of penalization of motherhood, which means that there is a lower fallback income for women, because women who become mothers are automatically shunned from the labor market because of care responsibilities, and if the state does not intervene in the form of investing in of providing public investments in care sector, then women of course cannot move out of their households. Care responsibility. Women's responsibilities for children and dependents, their time poverty, and the moral expectations of caregiving. There is often an obligation that is imposed upon women that care work is primarily women's work, and therefore that also reduces their exit options from provisioning of care related to motherhood. There are social norms and moral sanctions. As I have just mentioned, there's a lot of stigma attached to selfish mothers. So motherhood penalization and the guilt trip that is carried over to mothers who leave their children behind to come out to work, there's a lot of stigma attached there, which again reduces the exit options for women. There are cultural expectations of sacrifice. These bargaining threats are not credible because often there is a moral responsibility put on women that it is expected of them to sacrifice, to be more altruistic about their activities within the household. Now, to add on to these structures of constraint, so here labor market constraints, care responsibilities, social norms and moral sanctions, all of these become structures of constraint. And to add on to these, state policies. If the state also lacks childcare policies, there are weak social protection policies, and if the male breadwinner welfare assumption is very strong in state policies, so that then it deepens or intensifies the dependence on family as the unit of provisioning of care. And then these structures of constraint, these operate outside the household, but they decisively shape inside household outcomes. So in this class, if you look at some of these ideas that have been discussed by Marilyn Waring and Nancy Folbray, you will see that this automatically creates a situation where what we consider as the economy is actually excluding large numbers of activities that contributes to economic production but is not accounted for within the economy. And if when that happens, we see that the exclusion is not accidental but it is systemic. So these concepts will help us to understand the foundations of feminist economics. For this class, I have referred to a few essential readings by Marilyn Waring and Nancy Folbray. You may refer to them in the essential readings list. There are also a few selective readings which informs us about the system of national accounts starting from the 1950s till some of the recent years. I hope this class clarifies some of the important concepts surrounding foundations of feminist economics. I'll see you in the next class. Thank you.